Hey guys, today we are in the book of Romans, chapter 1. Now, as we left off yesterday in Acts chapter 28, I was telling you about how the letters were written. A lot of the letters in the New Testament were written in between his missionary travels. Romans is one of those books that happens. The book of Romans was written on the third missionary journey when he went to Corinth. He was at Corinth and he was writing this letter to the Roman Christians. It was written in about 58 AD, and it was written just before Paul left to go to Jerusalem, right before the Pentecost. So you can find that in Acts chapter 20, verse 16, and you can kind of plug in the book of Romans there. Now, the book of Romans, or the church of Romans, even though the Catholic Church says it was the first church and it was started by Peter, that's not true. We have no proof of any apostle ever going far north as Rome. So we believe that the Church of Rome, or really the Jewish Christians of Rome, was probably from Pentecost all the way back in Acts chapter 2. If you look in Acts chapter 2, verses 9 through 12, it lists off Jewish a bunch of Jewish people that were in Jerusalem that were from a bunch of Gentile nations, including the areas around Rome. And so we believe that some of them heard Peter's preaching, heard the apostles, were there at Pentecost, started to believe in Jesus, and as normal, they went home. They went back to Rome, and after that, the gospel continued to grow and grow and grow. And so, as Paul was traveling, he was hearing of the Christians that were growing in Rome. And so we will see many times through the book of Romans on how he wanted to go to Rome, but God never allowed him. God had different agenda for him to do, right? God knew what was best. And so he knew he wasn't going to make it to Rome. And so he wrote this letter in the end of his third missionary journey, right? So let's just kind of pick up. I will say at the beginning of this, Romans is a super deep book. It's not a long book, but it's super deep. So there's going to be a lot of things that you might want more detail in, and I just don't have time in these little videos. But if you read something and you want to know, please feel free to text me, call me, email me, Facebook message me, whatever, and I'll be glad to answer your questions, right? So we start in chapter 1. Verse 1, we see a couple things, right? So the first 7 verses are kind of what we would say is the opening thesis. The first 7 verses are really going to tell us what the whole book is about. All right, so we can first see that he is a servant of Jesus Christ. He's a doulos, which is the word slave or servant. He's a slave of Jesus Christ. He was called to be an apostle, kletos. This just means that he was not just he wasn't just saved, that he was given a position. He was summoned to work for God. In this, what did he do? He says that God promised in the beforehand in his prophets and the Holy Scriptures. So he's saying he's using the Old Testament to tell these Jews, Jewish Christians, right? First to the Jews, then the Gentiles, to give them proof that Jesus is the Messiah. And how is he the Messiah? We see in verse 3, he's a descendant from David, right? Fulfilling that Old Testament prophecy that goes all the way back to King David. And then you can jump to verse 5. It says, through whom we have received grace. It's a Christian word that we use all the time, but it just really means unmerited favor, right? That God gives us everything that we don't even deserve, and apostleship. He gives us grace and he gives us apostleship. Even though we are not one of the apostles, like Paul was and like the early disciples were, but we still have apostleship. We still have a commonship of all Christians that it's our job to go out and share the good news, to bring about obedience of faith. You see that? Obedience of faith? That's just another word for salvation. So we're to use our unmerited favor that we're given, in that we are to be in a commonship, we're to be an apostleship to bring about salvation to the world. We see in verse 7, to all those in Rome, to all the believers in Rome, you are loved by God and called to be saints, hagios, to be set apart, to be different, right? And so here starts the letter, right? So we kind of see what Paul's saying, that the Romans are called, they're saved. Jesus is the Messiah, and that they are special to God, right? And so we can see, starting in verse 8 through 15, we see that Paul wants to go. And we're going to see this many times throughout this letter. Paul always wanted to go to Rome. If you look at verse 13, it says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers. He's saying, I want you to know, Christians in Rome, I've often intended to come to you. Remember, he's in the end of his third missionary journey. He has gone close to Rome several times, right? He's intended to go there. But thus far I have been prevented. God would not allow him to go, in order that I may reap some harvest among you. He just didn't want to go for a social call. He wanted to go to Rome to share the gospel, to reap the harvest. That's what he wanted to do, right? Verse 16, Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power, it is the dunamis, it's the dynamite of God for salvation, right? So the gospel is the power in which people are saved. That is important, right? How do I know that I'm saved? Do you know the gospel? It is the death, the burial, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. That's the most important thing. Verse 17, for in it the righteousness of God, the justice of God, is revealed from faith to faith. That word revealed just means brought to light. It's through salvation that we see God's justice, God's holiness of who he is brought to light. And that's how we can believe that, receive that, and become saved. And then we get into really what I think most people know Romans 1 is about, right? And it's this word wrath. It's the word orge. And the word orge just means a settled determination. It's an idea that God is wholly righteous, but he is also wholly just, right? And so he can wholly love and keep somebody up and above, but those who disagree with him, then he will wholly keep them down and below. So we kind of have this idea. So this word wrath is just saying that God knows all. He knows who is saved and who is not saved. And for those who are not saved, they get orge. They get God's wrath, his settled determination, right? And so for the wrath of God is revealed, is brought to light from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, right? So ungodliness just means a lack of reverence, and unrighteousness just means ungodliness, but it's the results of people who are ungodly. Okay, so Paul is kind of setting up here, and remember, he wants to share the gospel. He wants to reap the harvest, but he's using this to say that the reason he wants to do this is because of God's wrath, right? He knows what is coming. He knows that God's holiness cannot be around sin, cannot be around ungodliness, people who have a lack of reverence for God, and their actions, which bring about unrighteousness. And so what happens? Those who are ungodly and those who have unrighteous acts, what happens? They suppress the truth. They suppress God's truth. And that's the reason we share the gospel, right? People don't know the truth, and those who don't know the truth, they suppress the truth. Lost people are not walking around knowing that they need salvation. It's up to us to tell them, because they have suppressed that. They don't know that. They need to hear the gospel so they know that they need a savior. Verse 19, For what can be known about God is plain to them. Every single human has all the evidence of God that they need. Every single human. Whether they've heard of Jesus, whether they've heard of Yahweh, of God, of the Bible, every single human has evidence. They know that there is something bigger and more supreme than them, and it's their job, and it's our job to be able to help them find who that is. And so we have that verse 21, for although they knew God in this natural, or what we call general revelation, by looking at the earth and saying, how did this get here? By looking at the stars, by looking at the rocks, right? To the basic form, they know that God exists, right? And even though they knew something was greater, they did not honor him as God, as divine, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, right? When we do not elevate God, we elevate ourselves, period. And so what happens is these people who are lost, they don't elevate God, right? Because they know there's a God, but they don't know who it is. They don't know how to know him. And so it's our job to come along, right? And so when we come along, and if we don't do that, what happens? Because they know there's a God, but they don't know him, they don't know of Jesus. They don't know how to be in a relationship with him. What happens? They don't elevate that God. They start to elevate themselves. And they do that in a lot of ways, not just make themselves God, but make idols and things that they build, pictures and animals and all types of sorts, things that they deem as holy, that they elevate, right? So even though it's maybe not themselves, it's through their mind and their heart that they elevate these other things, right? And so, and that's what it's talking about, verse 23. They exchange glory of God for images, for idols, resembling mortal man's, birds, animals, creeping things, right? So notice here in verse 24, 26, and 28, right? So because all of this happened, notice verse 24, therefore, right? What do I always say? When you see a therefore, figure out what it's there for, right? And so because all of these people have exchanged the wisdom of godliness for ungodliness, therefore, God is going to do what? Verse 24, notice the word, he gave them up. There's one. Verse 26, God gave them up. That's two. And verse 28, God gave them up 3 times. He gave them up 3 times. Now, what did he give up? Go back to verse 24. God gave them up. And that word, let me just help you out. That word gave them up is the word paradidomi. And it just means to mean committed to prison. It's a judicial term. That means they're guilty, right? It's the sentencing of somebody who has done something wrong. So when God gave them up, he's letting them go to their ultimate holding cell, right? To hell is what we were saying, right? Because they're not looking for God. They're not doing that. They've exchanged that for their own God, which is themselves, right? And because of that, God has given them up. He's given them up 3 times to 3 different things. Verse 24, he gave them up to the lust of their hearts. That's their inner condition, right? They want to be God. It's the first sin, right? In the garden, Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit because they wanted to know what God wanted to know, right? He gave them up to the lust of their hearts, not his heart, their heart. Verse 26, he gave them up to dishonorable passions, right? Which is the lust, the sexual lust, the sexual passions of their hearts, right? If they're going to put themselves first, the things that they want to do is going to be first in their hearts. And then thirdly, in verse 28, he's given them up to a debased mind, right? So this idea of the word debased, it means not standing the test. It was a blacksmith's term that when you would bring a gold ring and he would melt it down and all the impurities would rise up to it, and he would find out if that gold is not real or not, or he would scrape off all of the other metals that were mixed in with that gold to cheat, right? And so here God gave them up to their inner condition, right? To their sexual lust and passions, and to their impure hearts, their impure thoughts, their impurities. They never wanted to be holy like God. They wanted to be holy whatever they thought was holy, right? And so in this, God gave them up 3 times, and then jump to verse 32. He gave them up, but notice this in verse 32: though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such thing deserves to die, they do not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So these people who he gave up, they know in their heart of hearts that they're not God, right? And so because they know that they're not God, they know the things that they are doing are not right because they are not ultimately God. They know that in their heart of hearts, but they practice other things, right? And so with that idea, they know that they're not God, and they know the things that they do are not godly, but what do? They give approval to those who practice them. Not only is it bad enough that they do these things, but they approve and they encourage other people to do them, right? So it's kind of like this idea of saying, hey, I know this is really bad and I know this is a bad outcome and I should stop people from doing that. They do the opposite. Hey, I know this is really bad, and hey, I know this is a bad outcome, but they encourage and they approve other people to do this bad thing so that they are not alone by themselves, right? So you can just see the full kind of depravity of their heart is at hand, right? They know a God. They don't love that God. They don't want to worship that God. They elevated themselves to be a God, even though they're not God. And so because of that, they don't care about a God. They don't want to be with a God. And so not only do they themselves just say, hey, I don't want to know this God, but they approve and encourage other people not knowing who God is. And I think we can see this best today if you turn on any news channel, right? You will always see groups of people who are leading other people astray, further and further away from God. And that's exactly what Romans 1 is about. No one is holy, no one is good, and everybody is pushing everybody away from God except for those who know God. And those people should be trying to push people towards God. And it's this constant battle, right? The bad pushing away from God and the good pushing towards God. And that's what the book of Romans is going to be about for the next 15 chapters. Hope that makes sense. And I'm so glad that you're sticking around with us to continue our reading the New Testament in a year. And we will see you tomorrow in Romans chapter 2. God bless.